Hello there. I'm a day late reviewing 1977's Star Wars.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
This was the very first scene I saw in Star Wars. Mom always did things in her own time, and we arrived at the theater late. So the very first thing I saw was the hologram of Leia pleading for help from Obi-Wan. Despite that hiccup, the movie blew this 9-year-old me away. And why not? Prior to that, my favorite movie was At the Earth's Core. They are both adventure movies, but beyond that, they have nothing in common, and the only other space movies I had seen at that point were 2001: A Space Odyssey, Silent Running, War of the Worlds, and Forbidden Planet. And while they're all very entertaining and look great, only 2001 holds a candle to the effects in Star Wars. Of course, 2001 suffers from a dearth of action. Action is something that Star Wars excels at. 9-year-old me, and quite frankly, 55-year-old me, knows which one I prefer. Yeah, I know, I'm a Philistine. I saw it about 3 weeks after the movie first opened, at the Plitt Century Plaza Theater, which I have since learned closed back in 2003, which is too bad because that was a very nice theater back in the day. The main theater seated about 1,400 people in seats that had very plush cushions, and the backrest had some give in them so you could rock in the seat a bit. 9-year-old me was very impressed. And then there was the movie itself. Wow. I know that it's hard to imagine what it was like for the younger generations, but to give you an idea of how big this was, it ran in many theaters for a year straight. This, of course, was back when, if you wanted to see it, you had to go to the theater. There were no streaming services, no VHS, DVDs, or Blu-rays, but still, a whole year. That's staying power. Heck, we're still talking about the film today, 46 years after the movie was released, and we're still talking about it. That's staying power. So, let's get down to it. Star Wars is the story of a boy named Luke Skywalker and his emergence into a world much larger than he could imagine. The movie opens with a rebel cruiser running from an Imperial Star Destroyer. As we find out, Princess Leia is on board and has come to the planet Tatooine to find Obi-Wan Kenobi and bring him to her father on the planet Alderaan. However, she realizes they are about to be captured, and so she records a message for Kenobi and loads it and the schematics for the Empire's newest and deadliest weapon yet into the memory banks of the droid R2-D2. She then tells R2 to use an escape pod to get to the planet below and find Kenobi. R2 and his fellow droid, C-3PO, make it off the cruiser safely, while most of the crew is either killed or captured in the Imperial attack. One of those captured is Princess Leia, who's brought before Lord Vader. He wants to know what she did with the plans for the Death Star. She tries to play innocent.
I know nothing. Nothing.
Vader isn't buying it and has her taken to the brig while he and the troops search the rebel cruiser. News comes to him that an empty escape pod got away, and Vader is sure the plans must be on board the escape pod. He then orders them to send troops planetside to find the plans. Meanwhile, on the planet below, C-3PO and R2-D2 have landed in the middle of a desert. 3PO wants to head out into the sand as it looks easier, while R2 thinks the rocky area looks like a better place to find some form of civilization. The two end up going their separate ways. An unknown amount of time later, 3PO comes across the skeleton of some large creature, but no other signs of life. He is bemoaning his fate when he sees a transport in the distance and waves to try to get its attention. We then cut back to R2 and my experience with the Mandela Effect. The Mandela Effect is the name for the phenomena of remembering something that never happened. Now, in my case, I should inform you that between the summers of 77 and 78, I saw Star Wars 50 times. And I recall the scene where R2 travels into the canyon being at night. The Jawas jump out, stun him, and then they carry him off to their transport in relative darkness. I have the theatrical cut on DVD, released by Lucas, and what it shows is R2 traveling in the canyon during the day, in shade, but not dark. What I think has happened is that the scene was shot in day, and a filter was applied to the image after it to darken it. And when the original negatives were transferred to the new media, whoever did it forgot to apply a filter to darken the scene. Now, of course, it may have always been a day scene and appeared that way in the theaters as well, but I don't remember it that way. And the scene where the Jawas apply the restraining bolt to R2 and suck him up into the sandcrawler are clearly night scenes. Seems odd to me that it was daytime as they captured R2, and not 5 minutes later it's definitely night. So I'm going with they forgot the night filter for the DVD and Blu-ray releases. But if you have a different take on that, let me know in the comments. As it turns out, this is the same scavenger transport that found 3PO earlier, and he and R2 are reunited. Later, the transport arrives at the moisture farm of Owen Lars. Seeing how Tatooine is a desert planet, water, of course, is a much-needed commodity. The Jawas unload all the droids they have scavenged and put them on display for sale. 3PO and R2 are bought, and we are introduced to our protagonist, Luke Skywalker. Luke is tasked by his uncle to get the droids cleaned up and ready for use as workers on their moisture farm. Luke takes them to the service bay and works on getting them cleaned up. While cleaning R2, he accidentally causes the message from Princess Leia to Obi-Wan Kenobi to play. At least partially. Luke is mesmerized by the princess's beauty and intrigued by the message, and he wants R2 to play the whole thing. R2 says that the restraining bolt is causing his recording system to glitch, and if it is removed, then maybe he could play the whole thing. Luke doesn't think that there's any place for R2 to run off to, so he removes the restraining bolt. The message stops, and R2 feigns ignorance as to ever having shown the message in the first place.
I know nothing. Nothing.
Before Luke can do anything further to get R2 to show the message, Luke's aunt calls him to dinner. Luke goes to the dining area where we get some character building. Luke tells his aunt and uncle that he's happy with the 2 new droids, and if they work out well, he would like to transmit his application to the Academy this year. Uncle Owen harumphs that he really needs Luke's help with the farm, and if they have a good harvest this year, he can buy some more droids and Luke can go next year. Disappointed, Luke huffs off because he believes he's never going to get off this farm. Then we get the classic scene with Luke staring off into the distance with wanderlust in his eye, as the twin suns of Tatooine set. Luke then goes back to the service bay to check on the 2 new droids and finds 3PO in hiding. It turns out that R2 was not too small to run off, and Luke runs back up to the surface to see if he can spot R2 anywhere. R2 is gone. And as it's getting dark, Luke can't go searching for the wayward droid as the Sand People come out at night. Luke and 3PO take off early in the morning to go find R2. They find him quite a distance away. As they're about to head back to the farm, R2 announces that his sensor shows that there are several creatures approaching nearby. Now the smart thing to do would be to get the heck out of Dodge, but Luke wants to go take a look. Unfortunately for him, he is discovered and attacked by some Sand People. Luke is knocked out and 3PO falls off the ledge of the overlook that they were on. The Sand People then set to work stripping Luke's landspeeder. Before they can get too much done, they hear the shriek of another creature and flee in terror. A lone figure nears and checks to see if Luke is alright. It's Ben Kenobi, a crazy old man who lives on his own out in the middle of nowhere. Kenobi asks Luke what he's doing so far out in the desert. Luke tells him that the R2 unit is looking for an Obi-Wan Kenobi and asks if it is a relative of Ben's. Kenobi says no, that it is a name that he used to go by a long time ago. They then hear the growls of Sand People in the distance and decide to gather up the droids and go before things turn ugly again. We then arrive at Kenobi's home. Here we get some backstory. Ben used to be a Jedi Knight along with Luke's father, before the Empire took over. This is all news to Luke, as his uncle told him that Luke's father was a pilot on a spice freighter. Kenobi tells Luke that his uncle Owen told him that because he was afraid that Luke would decide to join up with Kenobi and go gallivanting around the galaxy if he knew the truth. Kenobi then gets R2 to play the full message. In it, Princess Leia begs Kenobi to bring the R2 unit to the planet Alderaan to her father, because inside its memory core are the plans to Empire's new weapon, the Death Star. Kenobi wants Luke to come along, saying that he's too old to do it by himself. Luke waffles, saying that he can give Kenobi a lift to a nearby town, but he can't go flying off on some crazy adventure. He has chores to do on the farm. Kenobi says he understands. We then cut to the Death Star. We see a Star Destroyer flying towards it, and we see how small the once humongous Star Destroyer is in comparison. So this thing is huge. We then cut to a meeting room with several Imperial officers arguing. One says that the rebellion is a threat. The other says that it isn't to this new battle station. Grand Moff Tarkin and Lord Vader then enter the room. Tarkin informs him that the Emperor has dissolved the Senate and the regional governors will now control their sectors. The one commander is still worried that the rebels could be a problem since they have the plans for the Death Star. Lord Vader assures him that they will recover the plans soon. The other Imperial officer says that it doesn't matter what the rebels have, since the Death Star is unbeatable. Lord Vader admonishes him, saying that it pales in comparison to the Force. The officer is dismissive of Vader, saying that no one is impressed by his sorcerous ways, that the Force hasn't helped him to find the plans or the rebel base. Vader then force chokes him until Tarkin orders him to stop. Vader stops and Tarkin announces that Vader will have the plans by the time that the station is fully operational, and then they will use it to destroy the rebellion. Back on Tatooine, Luke, Ben, and the droids come across the destroyed sandcrawler of the Jawas that had sold the droids to Luke's uncle. Luke says it looks like it was done by sand people, but Ben says that it was Imperial troops. Luke doesn't understand why Imperial troops would do this until he sees the droids, and then it occurs to him if they were looking for the droids, then they might be headed for the farm.
Bogus!
He bolts for the land speeder, and Ben tells him that it's too dangerous, but Luke won't hear of it and he takes off. He races back to the farm to find it ablaze. As he gets closer, he then discovers the remains of his aunt and uncle. Luke returns to the blasted sandcrawler, and he tells Kenobi that he wants to go to Alderaan with him, and that he wants to learn to become a Jedi like his father. They then head to Mos Eisley, the nearest spaceport on the planet, to find a transport for Alderaan. Once in Mos Eisley, we come to a bar that is a hot spot for pilots. Inside, they find a smuggler named Han Solo who is willing to transport them to Alderaan. He's a bit pricey, but assures them that he can help them avoid any Imperial forces. Luke and Ben leave to sell Luke's speeder for money for the trip. But before he can leave, Solo is intercepted by one of the local crime lord's gun hands named Greedo. It's here that we learn that Solo isn't above shooting someone underneath a table if they threaten to kill him. Of course, in the special edition, Luke has changed it so that Greedo shoots first and misses from 3 feet away. Oi.
What?
My understanding is that he didn't want Solo to come off as a cold-blooded killer, but quite frankly, when someone is pointing a gun at you and they say that they're going to kill you, I'd take them at their word. So I see it as self-defense. Plus, Solo is supposed to be a bit of a scoundrel, have a dangerous edge to him. He is a smuggler, after all. Anyways, put me in the Han was the only one to shoot camp. Luke, Ben, and the droids arrive at the docking bay housing the Millennium Falcon, Solo's ship. Luke isn't impressed.
What a piece of junk!
But Solo reassures him that the Falcon will get the job done. As the passengers board, stormtroopers arrive and have a shootout with Solo. Solo kills several and runs up the boarding ramp, screaming to his co-pilot Chewbacca to get them out of there. They make it into orbit, and several Star Destroyers come after them, trying to capture them. And in one of the coolest scenes I have ever seen as a child, the ship jumps into hyperspace and leaves the Imperials far behind.
Excellent!
Probably not too impressive to the younger generations out there that have grown up on CGI and movies like The Matrix or Avatar, but holy smokes, I still think it looks fantastic. Cut to the Death Star and time to see what it can do. Grand Moff Tarkin has brought it to the Alderaan system to see if he can encourage Princess Leia to give up the location of the rebel base. For the lives of the people of her homeworld, Leia reluctantly gives it up, for all the good it does her, as Tarkin then orders the destruction of Alderaan as an example of the power of the Empire. We do find out later that Leia was lying too. Back on the Falcon, Ben is giving Luke lessons on using the Force. Solo expresses his doubts, but Luke manages to tap into the power, if only for a moment. An alarm then sounds, alerting Solo that they are nearing the Alderaan system. The Falcon comes out of hyperspace, only to be immediately pelted by the debris of the destroyed planet. They then come under attack from an Imperial TIE fighter. Determined to destroy it before it can report their location, Solo chases after it. The bad news? It's headed for the nearby Death Star. Too late, they realize the small moon isn't a moon. Worse still, they are caught in a tractor beam that is too strong for them to overcome. And as they are pulled closer to the Death Star, we see this. As a child, it never occurred to me to question what I was seeing. Now, young me took the line, "That small moon," to heart, and thought that the Death Star was, if not equal to our moon, maybe half the size of that. Our moon has a diameter of almost 2,160 miles. It turns out that the official diameter of the Death Star per StarWars.com is 100 miles. So as a man-made structures go, that's quite impressive. But when you see it in comparison, Still, I gotta admit, when I watch the movie, I still think of it as a small moon. So when the Millennium Falcon is caught in the tractor beam and pulled towards the equatorial trench, we see this image, as if the surface of the Death Star is the side of a building. But if you think of the surface of the Death Star being similar to the surface of the Earth, then this image should actually look like this. No doubt the Death Star has the ubiquitous artificial gravity common in all sci-fi movies, but later in the film we see the defense towers rising from the surface and also sitting on the floor of a trench as well. And this is in contradiction to the orientation of the defense turrets guarding the landing bay. So how does gravity work on this thing? I don't know. Anyways, the Falcon lands and is given a quick once-over by some troops who don't find anyone. They report this to Vader, who orders them to get a scanning team to check out the ship. And this makes me think of earlier in the movie when we saw this.
There goes another one.
Hold your fire. There's no life forms. It must have short-circuited.
So the Death Star doesn't have sensors to detect the life forms at a distance? Nice. As the last of the troops leave after making a cursory check of the ship, we learn that our intrepid band of heroes was hiding in some smuggling apartments in the floor. They then ambush the scanning team as it comes on board and call down to the pair of stormtroopers saying that they need some help. Now they have some disguises. They make their way to a command node overlooking the landing bay and take out the Imperial station there. Kenobi then has R2 link into the Imperial data network to find the location of the tractor beam power control. Once it is located, Kenobi says that he will handle it and he wants the others to wait for him there. After he leaves, R2 discovers that Princess Leia is on board and is scheduled for execution.
Bogus.
Luke comes up with an idea of pretending Chewbacca is a prisoner to be added to the cell block that the princess is being held at while he and Han are stormtroopers. Once they get to the cell block, Chewbacca breaks free and they kill all the guards. Luke heads down the cell block until he finds Leia, but the firefight with the guards did not go unnoticed. Just as Luke and Leia exit her cell, Han and Chewie come running up to them, fleeing from stormtroopers that have come to see what's going on in the cell block. Trapped, Leia takes Luke's blaster and shoots the grate on the wall that covers a chute. Everyone dives down into it, and we discover that it was a garbage chute that leads into a trash compactor. A trash compactor that is sealed against laser beams, and has a monster in it as well. In movie terms, this is known as escalating tension, and as a kid I loved it, but as an adult, it's pretty silly, and to top it off, the walls start closing in. Luke remembers his comm link to the droids, and he has them stop the compactor at the last moment, and then open it so that they can leave. Meanwhile, Kenobi has found and deactivated the power source for the tractor beam. Now everyone just needs to make it back to the Falcon. Kenobi is on his way when he encounters Vader. They draw their lightsabers and begin to duel. The rest of the gang makes it back to the hangar bay, but the Falcon is guarded by troops. Only the troops see Vader and Kenobi having their duel, and so they leave their posts. Our heroes make their way to the Falcon, but Luke stops short when he sees Kenobi and Vader. Kenobi sacrifices himself, and his ghostly voice tells Luke to run.
Run, Luke, run!
With everyone now on board the Falcon, they blast off and head away from the Death Star, but not before they have to deal with several TIE fighters on patrol. Once again, we have an interesting bit of gravity going on. When Luke and Han climb up and down their respective gun turrets, Han goes to the top turret and sits down in his chair with the tunnel behind his back. Gravity should be pulling him back into the seat. And at the bottom of the tunnel is Luke, and he should be hanging tight against the seat belt. Neither appears to be the case. Still, it's an exciting bit of cinema as they take out the TIE fighters. The Falcon then makes the jump to hyperspace and heads for the Rebel base. Back on the Death Star, we find out that Vader had troops plant a tracking device on the Falcon and convinced Tarkin to let them go, hoping that they would lead them to the base. Our heroes make it to the Rebel base and hand over the Death Star plans. Techs analyze the plans and do discover a weakness. The Death Star has a thermal port that leads directly to the main power plant. If the Rebels can fire a proton torpedo into the port, it should destroy the Death Star.
Excellent!
Then, showing perfect timing, the Death Star arrives in the system containing the Rebel base, but is on the far side of the planet that the Rebel moon orbits. In 30 minutes, the Death Star will circle the planet and have a clear shot at destroying the base.
Bogus.
The Rebels then launch their meager force of fighters in the hope that they can destroy the Death Star before it can destroy their base. The Rebel fighters streak to and fro across the space of the Death Star, shooting targets of opportunity. An officer reports to Lord Vader that because the fighters are so small and fast, that their defense lasers are having difficulty tracking and destroying them. Vader orders that they launch a force of TIE fighters. And now it's game on.
Game on! Game on!
There is a lot of back and forth between the Rebels and the Imperials until the Rebels find the thermal port trench and start making their attack runs. Now, either the exhaust port is in another trench, or they also goofed on the scale of the trench between now versus earlier in the film. Because look at how wide this trench is with the Falcon in it versus how tight this is with some TIE fighters and Y-Wings. I'm going to say it's a different trench. Anyways, once the rebels start heading for the thermal trench, Vader joins the fight. He quickly makes short work of most of the rebels until it's Luke's turn to make the trench run. Once again, Vader drops behind the rebels and starts to take them out until it's just Luke left. Things are looking bad until the Falcon swoops out of nowhere and destroys one of Vader's wingmen, causing the other to bump into Vader's fighter and send it spinning off into space. Luke uses the Force and senses the correct time to fire his proton torpedoes. He hits the target, and the few surviving rebels flee the Death Star just as it clears the planet and is about to fire on the rebel moon. At the last second, the Death Star explodes before it can fire its laser. The surviving rebels make it back to the rebel base, and Luke and Han are awarded medals, and Chewie gets to stand next to them. Forgotten are Wedge and an unknown Y-Wing pilot. Sure, they fought at the Battle of the Death Star, but it isn't like they fired the shot that destroyed it. The end. So there you have it, Star Wars. Sure, it has some issues, but I have to admit, I don't care. I love this film. So many fond memories of seeing this over the years. It's fast-paced, generally well acted, and has state-of-the-art effects for the time. It's George Lucas's ode to movie serials that he used to watch as a kid, only with a much improved budget. Now I'm sure there are a few people who will see this video and are wondering to themselves why I'm calling the movie Star Wars and not Episode 4, A New Hope. That's because I saw it during the original release when it was only called Star Wars. It didn't get the A New Hope moniker until after Lucas released The Empire Strikes Back with the words Episode 5 in the title crawl. That created quite a stir at the time, and Lucas had to give several interviews explaining that when he envisioned his story, it was too big for one movie. That he hoped to tell it over 9 and possibly up to 12 movies. Well, I can tell you that sent a thrill through most fans' little hearts, because at the time we only had Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back to judge the series on. Of course that was, as someone once famously said,
Before the dark times. Before the Empire.
As a solo film, it works brilliantly. Lucas gives you just enough information to understand what's going on without bogging down into too much minutia. That comes later. There is one issue that I didn't appreciate until I was older. As a 9-year-old, I could follow the story, but didn't think too much about it. I was more into, that looked cool, as opposed to, why are they doing this? That question refers to, why did Princess Leia go to Tatooine to get Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first place? As Kenobi himself says,
I'm getting too old for this sort of thing.
and as we learn in the film, Kenobi is a retired Jedi Knight, not an engineer. He's not going to be any use deciphering the Death Star plans. As to taking the plans to Alderaan, Princess Leia could have done that herself. Kenobi exists because Lucas had read Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and was interested in the hero archetype. And his hero needed a mentor, so we have Ben Kenobi. And by bringing the plans to Kenobi, our hero is introduced to the larger world and the adventure ahead. So the beginning is a bit nonsensical, but despite that, I still love this film. This is not to say I don't have other issues with some of the storytelling, but that involves things revealed in the sequels and prequels. As a standalone movie experience, I love this film. It was written and directed by George Lucas, who originally wanted to direct a Flash Gordon movie, but could not get the rights. So he ended up writing his own space adventure, and as it happens, things turned out pretty good for him. He's best known for writing and directing THX 1138, American Graffiti, Star Wars, and the Star Wars prequels, and for coming up with the stories for the Indiana Jones movies. It stars Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Alec Guinness, Peter Cushing, and David Prowse / James Earl Jones. I think they all do a fine job, especially the old pros, who really elevate the material. The movie was rated PG for violence. It cost $11 million to make and took in $265 million in its initial run. But it has been re-released several times in the intervening years, and as of 2023, it has a worldwide box office of $775 million. Not too shabby. It has an 8.6 out of 10 on IMDb, a 90 out of 100 on Metacritic, and Rotten Tomatoes has it at 93% per critics and 96% per audience scores. So I'm not in the minority for my love of this film. Check it out. You just might enjoy it. Thanks for watching, and until next time.
It's one small step for man.
Now,